Yesterday, Press Secretary Jean-Pierre was grilled on anti-Semitic threats facing Jewish students on college campuses in the United States. Let's watch.
Does President Biden look at these anti-Israel protests on college campuses and think it's nice to see that the country's youth are so involved, or does he think the next generation is doomed?
Here's the thing. There's no place for hate in America. No. I'm telling you, there's no place for hate in America, and we condemn any anti-Semitic threat or incident in the strongest terms. And you heard me say at the top, I gave a message to students who are feeling under threat right now, right? You know, we're tracking these threats very closely. We are there for them. No student should have to be able to go to class, live on campus in fear.
Meanwhile, over the weekend, an anti-Israeli mob broke out in an airport in Dagestan as hundreds of men crowded on the tarmac in an attempt to block a plane carrying Israeli refugees from Tel Aviv. Protesters outside carried signs such as, quote, "We are against Jewish refugees," and, quote, "There is no place for child killers in Dagestan." Per the Associated Press, 20 were injured, prompting President Putin to close the airport. Dagestan is a majority Muslim region under Russian control. So I think this is, a perfect example of you can't hold a population of people accountable for the crimes of others. The Israeli government is not the whole of the Jewish people. We've seen anti-Semitism and Islamophobia on the rise as this conflict intensifies. And if you're someone who's extremely critical of Israel, it doesn't mean that you should hate all Jewish people because Israel has been developed as a Jewish ethno-state. If you condemn the acts of Hamas, it doesn't mean that you hate everyone who's Muslim. This comes as a 6-year-old Muslim boy was killed in the United States in Chicago, and a 42-year-old doctor, a Muslim woman, was killed in Houston. We really cannot hold people who are Muslim and people who are Jewish accountable for the actions of Hamas or the Israeli government.
Well said. Certainly not. I think this was horrifying, astonishing to watch mobs of people essentially hunting down Jews to harass them in this airport. We are fortunate that we haven't seen anything anywhere near to that degree in the U.S. so far, and hopefully we won't. I think it's absolutely important and critical to condemn anti-Semitism. Some of these protests, again, of course, you have the right to engage in anti-Semitic protest in America. You engage in whatever protest you want. It can be as hateful or not hateful as you want it to be, and people can criticize you for it. I certainly think some of the protests that are going on right now have included messages of hate and intolerance, not just aimed at the Israeli government, but at all Jewish people, including on college campuses. The projecting of some of those messages against the buildings, and there's been, we discussed threats of violence that were made at Cornell yesterday or over the weekend. So there's a lot of heat and anger going on, and people should protest. They should keep it civil. They should not engage in violence. They should not destroy property, but they should absolutely protest and be heard. I think that's fine, and that's our First Amendment tradition. And anyone suggesting otherwise is wrong. I saw Chris Christie recently saying that anti-Israel speech is hate speech and ought not to be tolerated. And this is the same trap that I've accused the left of falling, or progressives of falling into multiple times. People, liberals, saying, well, I support free speech, but not hate speech, trying to draw some arbitrary distinction there. There is no Supreme Court recognized difference between free speech and hate speech. What is hateful is subjective and is absolutely protected by the First Amendment unless it rises to actual incitement to violence or organizing a violent incident. Then it is indeed free speech, even if you don't like what it says.
I think Jean-Pierre has just not done a great job throughout the duration of her time as press secretary, but especially as it pertains to this conflict. Peter Doocy of Fox News asked a question about protests on college campuses, about demonstrations, whether it was demonstrations in support of Israel where they've happened, but there have been massive pro-Palestine demonstrations, people who support the ending of the occupation, people who support a ceasefire. Many people have been arrested for demonstrating in public, but a lot of the college campus protests have not received news coverage. And these are protests in the case of Los Angeles. You had the protest climb up to 50,000 people in the streets of LA. These are huge demonstrations. And that is what Peter Doocy asked about. He asked about young people demonstrating, specifically on college campuses. In the case of Columbia University, there was an effort to not allow press to cover the pro-Palestine rally. This is not an anti-Semitic rally. To say that you condemn the actions of the Israeli government is not anti-Semitic. To say that you disagree with Netanyahu is something that many Jewish Israelis do themselves, 49% not supporting the Netanyahu regime because of the reason that they blame him for the actions that happened on October 7th, whether that's because he is someone who initially funded Hamas or what have you. There is still anti-Israeli government sentiments among the Jewish community and among the Jewish community living in Israel today. So to say that, you condemn anti-Semitism in response to a question about the protests happening on college campuses is absurd. There was no comment there about Islamophobia. There was no comment there about the political thrust of the protests. It seems as though Jean-Pierre doesn't support the protests based on this response, which I think is Jean-Pierre hinting that she doesn't support free speech, which is the kind of tyrannical situations we've had in the past when you've had folks protesting wars that the United States is involved in to quell anti-war sentiments at a time of war and call them unpatriotic, or in this case, anti-Semitic. It's really dangerous. It gets right at the heart of free speech, what you were just talking about.
Well, yeah, that's fair enough. And in fact, I don't care if the government comments on anything. Government should just stop commenting on any, stop encouraging censorship by taking the action they do. That's not really my. I do think that, and it depends what's happening at the protest. It depends what's being said. I think some of the protests that are just for peace and for a ceasefire and oppose the actions of the Israeli government, absolutely fine. I'm simpatico with all of that. That's fine. There have been protesters at the rally in, I think it was in New York, that was partly supported by the DSA, where there was a speaker who celebrated what Hamas had done. Another DSA chapter put out a statement celebrating that. Black Lives Matter Chicago did that. I've read through this National Students for Justice in Palestine toolkit that caused Ron DeSantis to label this group as supporters of terrorism and have them shut down on University of Florida campuses. I absolutely oppose him doing that. I wrote against it. I've spoken against it. They have free speech rights to sympathize with Hamas if they want. I do think they're anti-Semitic, and I read through the toolkit where they say, today we witness a historic win for Palestinian resistance. They're referring to the terrorist attacks. That to me, that is obviously they're endorsing what Hamas did on October 7th, and that is, in fact, it's stronger than anti-Semitism. It's a celebration of terrorism. So I strongly condemn and think it's absolutely correct to condemn this group, Students for Justice in Palestine, for supporting the actions of a terrorist group that led to the indiscriminate killing of 1,700 people. But they have the right to do it, and they can hold protests and rallies where they do it on college campuses or elsewhere. I don't think their rights should be restricted whatsoever.
Yeah, I think Jean-Pierre really botched the response there. I think there are a lot of students on college campuses who are kids. They're figuring out the world. In many cases, they're young people who didn't live through the Iraq War in a way that, we did, Robbie. This is their conflict. And, they're taking to the campus green. They're taking to the streets in protest. People are being passed the microphone who might say things like, this action by Hamas was done so in retaliation of the Israeli government killing of civilians. It was done in retaliation for the occupation that's lasted 75 years. But then there are also people on mainstream media, on CBS, on CNN, on Fox, who are adults, who are making excuses for the war crimes being committed by the Israeli government right now. It's just a really disgusting time that you have people who are adults who are doing this job for a living, who should theoretically be careful about what they're supporting in the international arena, who are making excuses for Israel having a blockade on Gaza, bombing the exits, and then having a ground campaign where you have Israeli officials saying that we're going to need to shoot anything that moves, that everything is a target there, that we gave everyone in Gaza a proper chance to get out when they absolutely did not. UN reports have highlighted that they've bombed the exits, that this is a case of collective punishment, according to many international law scholars. And then you have people on mainstream news making excuses for that kind of violence. And I think, it is free speech, but to condemn college kids for making this case that's pro-Palestine on campus when you have mainstream media making excuses for violence on a much greater scale, it really puts things in perspective, especially Corinne Jean-Pierre's response there. I think she goes on to compare it to Charlottesville. And I think absolutely we have to condemn anti-Semitism, but the vast majority of people protesting for Palestine are not anti-Semitic. They have not said things that are anti-Semitic, not to mention the Palestinian population are Semites. I understand that the popular use of the word anti-Semitic applies to the Jewish community, especially in the United States, but it really wasn't appropriate for Corinne Jean-Pierre to say that there. And I think Peter Doocy was right to push back. I know he's been kind of a thorn in the side of the press secretary, whether it's Jen Psaki or Corinne Jean-Pierre for this administration, but I think it was a valid question.
I mean, but is students... You might know better than I do. Students for Justice in Palestine. I understand that to be a fairly large student group, important activist group on this cause, not like an obscure fringe group. And again, I'll read what their toolkit says. Today, we witness a historic win for the Palestinian resistance. Across land, air, and sea, our people have broken down the artificial barriers of the Zionist entity. National liberation is near. Glory to our resistance, to our martyrs, and to our martyrs, and to our steadfast people. That's referring to the violence on October 7th. I can't read that as anything other than endorsement of terrorist activity. And so I think it is absolutely fair to call this group, if they're anti-Semitic, based on what their rally is. Again, they have every right to be it, but I'm not going to mince words about it. If you're endorsing what Hamas did, you're endorsing terrorism.
Right. I think, there are a lot of analogies we could put into place here, but to just deal with it for how it exists, you had an occupation on the people of Palestine for 75 years. They don't have a military to fight back. You have 31,000 civilians being killed by the Israeli government in 1 year. And then you have Palestinians largely unable to fight back. Many people see this one action as the only way that Palestinians could fight back, could get their voice across, because so many of them were killed when they tried to peacefully protest in 2018. I think back to South Africa to bring the analogy in now. I would think this would be equivalent of, when you had the African National Congress, the Early Liberation League, Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela fighting back against the apartheid government in South Africa. They were bombing civilians. That was an effort for liberation. And I think it's kind of interesting that you have so many people on mainstream media making excuses for what the Israeli government is doing in retaliation to 1,400 Israelis being killed, but many people not framing the 31,000 Palestinians that were killed in 2018 when they tried to have mass mobilization and peaceful protests against the occupation.
Do you think liberation for the Palestinian people, equal political representation, a better outcome, better lives for them, do you think that's closer, more likely, or less likely than it was on October 6th? I think the answer is pretty obvious. I don't think this action has been good for the Palestinians or is likely to make peace, better treatment, full rights, a separate state, or inclusion in the state that exists. I don't think any of those goals are. I think it's naive in the extreme to think that this action has resulted in some good for the Palestinians or will in the near future. I think peace is far less likely than it was before.
Well, Israel has been a longtime ally of the United States, and there have been largely pro-Israel sentiments within the United States Following the actions on October 7th, we had the Israeli government respond in the way that they usually do, in a very gruesome way, killing many civilians. And this has brought more attention on the issue than I think in my lifetime. And there's more pro-Palestinian and understanding of the conflict as it's existed for 75 years than I think ever before in my lifetime. To have the entire United Nations voting on a ceasefire, the General Assembly, to have the kind of focus on this conflict that we haven't had before, and understanding of it is similar, I would say historically, to the kind of political shift we saw before we saw the international community support the ending of apartheid in South Africa. I think they have brought themselves closer slightly to the international community recognizing this. If there will be actual action towards peace before the Israeli government kills so many civilians that they've reached the point of no return, I can see that being very likely because of how the Israeli government has retaliated with what 800 international law scholars have called a genocide. I think the Israeli government has really responded in a way that has made peace almost impossible in the region. Of course, we would like to see peace happen, but I think more people understand the conflict and are supportive of the Palestinian struggle than ever before.
Seems like a lot of needless death and destruction to raise understanding. We'll see if that gets anywhere. More Rising right after this.